yoga of the natural state, the Dzogchen Aural Lineage. So can you tell us a little bit, maybe we start with the Dzogchen Aural Lineage.
Yes.
What are we talking about when we say Dzogchen Aural Lineage? And as opposed to what?
Okay, so in Dzogchen teachings, we have two primary lineages. We have what's known as an oral lineage, which is a lineage which is a teacher gives you some teaching, then you turn around and you give that teaching to the next person in that particular line, and it's something that, it's the herd lineage, if you will. Not oral, O-R-A-L, but A-U-R-A-L, oral. Because Nyen does, sometimes you see people translate Nyen Gyud as oral lineage, but honestly, it's a little inaccurate.
Not Kagyu.
Huh?
Not Kagyu, no.
Yeah, that would be an oral lineage, Kagyu. But Ka also means more something also like command here.
Yeah.
But in any case, the main point here is that in Dzogchen teachings, actually all Buddhist teachings, every single Buddhist teaching began as an oral lineage. That's why all Buddhist sutras and tantras begin with the phrase, "Thus have I heard at one time." Thus have I heard it said at one time. Now, very often people translate this into Western scholars and people, as Evam Mayam Shruta Ekas Min. But the Tibetans say something like DK. Yes, and so Lama Mikmar, for example, was chiding me one day when he noticed how I was translating and said, no, that DK is really important. You have to include that. Thus I heard that it was said at one time, because we always leave out the said. Thus I heard at one time is usually how you will see most sutra, at the beginning of most sutras translated. But you don't hear, thus I heard it said at one time. And the Tibetan actually preserves that. Whether it's justified in the Sanskrit or not, I don't know. But, well, also there is an argument by Desi Sangha Gyatso that shrutam means both heard and said. So, who knows? Anyway, remember you were talking earlier today about how there's an argument in Sanskrit that if you can interpret a Sanskrit sentence and it makes sense based on the etymology, then it's valid even if the author didn't intend it this way. So
fair game.
Anyway, so everything is fair game in Sanskrit, which is why it's such a miserable language. But so anyway, the point here is that in oral lineage, of course, it's spoken by a teacher to a student, and we know that the first oral lineage was everything that the Buddha actually said to someone, somewhere, at some time. And so our entire tradition really is an oral lineage. And then after the oral lineage, you have what are known as texts. So in Dzogchen, we have this distinction, particularly in what we call the the Upadesha series, or the Intimate Instruction series, where we have what's called the oral lineage, and we have what's known as the text lineage, or the explanatory lineage, Pegyud or Shegyud. Longchenpa uses both of these terms in his texts. So at any event, now there's a whole history here, which you can actually read, because Longchenpa gives this history. The importance of the people have not spent any attention, have not paid any attention thus far, and now if this is going to change with the publication of this book, but people have paid absolutely no attention to the oral lineage of the oral lineages in general of Dzogchen teachings. And in my introduction, I go through all of them historically, trying to locate this Intimate Instruction series oral lineage within the broader context of Dzogchen oral lineages. And there are oral lineages which are in what is classified as the so-called Mind series, what's called the Space series in its entirety is what they call a Nagyud. That is like Na, Ratanana. So Na means ear. So you have Nyen, which means to hear, and you have Na, which means ear. So it's Longde, it's referred to as a Nagyud, an ear lineage, literally, meaning something, again, hearing lineage. So, and specifically in Longde, Longde specifically describes itself as being the oral lineage of the Dzogchen tradition connected with what we call the 5 what we call the text lineage of Sende. So the Longde tradition actually very self-consciously is an oral lineage, and it comes from Vairochana through Yudra Ningpo through Pangmi Pongompo to Yudra Ningpa, etc. The famous story about this is that Vairochana met this old man who could barely sit straight, and he was like, "I'm 80, I'm really old. Do you have a method for me that doesn't involve any kind of physical effort or whatever?" And he was so infirm that, you know, he had to hold his chin up with a stick. And so Longchenpa, and so Vairochana, he wrote, there's 40 verses on his stick to remind him of the nature of the teachings. And then now we have this thing called the Vajra Bridge, which Norpa Rinpoche also taught.
There's no Longde textual tradition, or?
Well, no, not really. There's like a few verse texts,
Yeah.
and there's a textual from the 12th century onward. Text started being written down.
Yeah. But primarily it's a Nyingyu.
Well, but basically it's a Nyengyud, apart from a couple of very short, brief texts by Vairochana.
Got it.
And but most of the information about how to practice Longde
Yep.
was transmitted orally. And interestingly enough, the person who is responsible for merging this Longde lineage with the Anu Yoga system of Nunzuk Gyalpo, this is a particular type of Heruka, was a guy named Zeng Dharma Bodhi, and Zeng Dharma Bodhi exchanged Mahamudra teachings with Gampopa and gave Gampopa Dzogchen teachings during the sort of early part of the 12th century. So we know for a fact that Gampopa also was a Dzogchen practitioner. In any event, one of the things that's very useful about the oral lineage teachings is that they're easy to remember. The teachings of the 17 Tantras are extremely arcane, complicated, have a lot of different parts. These days have been mostly distilled into what we commonly refer to as Tekchot and Togal. But the original tradition was a great deal more rich than what we have today. Partially, this is because, and I think I've mentioned this before in our Dharma chats, as Longchenpa was so successful in synthesizing the material in the 17 Tantras that people just started ignoring the rest of it, because when we talk about the Pegyud or the Shegyud, it's divided into 3 different sections. There's those people who like the elaborate explanations, who want all the philosophical bells and whistles. Then there's the people who like less elaboration, but they still like more something to do. So for them, we have yoga of clothing, yoga of food, yoga of sleep, yoga of, this, that, conduct, and so on and so forth. It's more elaborate. And then you have people who don't like elaboration at all, and for them, these people, they practice just Tekchot and Togal. Tekchot means something like, for those of you who are not so familiar with Dzogchen teachings, Tekchot means something like, well, the way Norma Rinpoche translated it is that Tekchot means total relaxation. Because the metaphor that we use to describe Tekchot is not cutting through. Because the problem is with saying cutting through is that there's no agent in Tekchot. So if you say cutting, then you have an agent. But actually the chupa in this particular context is an intransitive verb, so there's no agent. So it just means, and then trek means something which is bundled together. So in Eastern Tibetan language, if you have a bundle of wood, a tekshing means just a bundle of wood which is bound together with a cord. So in this case then, and also in the Kunchok Chidu, that's a Terma cycle from the 17th century, in the Kunchok Chidu there's a metaphor where it talks about Tekchot, and it mentions that basically it's like a sheaf of barley that's fallen apart.
You cut
The string isn't cut, the string just comes undone.
Just comes undone.
Yeah, and then it falls
So
apart.
because there's no agent, is that?
Yeah, there's no one cutting it, it just busts.
Yeah.
So that's why Norma Rinpoche translate this as total relaxation, because no one's doing anything. You're just relaxing. There's nothing for you to do now, because now you're just resting in the view of the basis. As you understand this meaning of karak, this meaning of original purity. You understand your primordial potential. You're not working with it necessarily so much, but you understand it, you know it. Whereas Togol, and like the way Dzogchen Sengé Wangchuk talks about it, he says it means to leap over, which is one particular translation. But actually, really the word, this is your tupa in Tibetan,
Touch of the
right, your forehead.
Yeah.
And Gawa means a little bit in front of your forehead.
Yeah.
So this is talking about a particular type of visionary practice that the person does, which has something to do with this way of light that we were talking about.
It's really cool, that etymology.
Now, that's the practice for people for very unelaborate. And so there's a great deal of explanation that goes into this. It's kind of complicated. The aural lineage, on the other hand, really only talks about two phases of practice. It talks about the practice of radiance, which is the practice for liberation in this life, and it talks about the practice of luminosity, which is the practice for liberation in the bardo. Yeah. And so fundamentally speaking, we can understand really, because even in the Pegyud, the Shegyud tradition, they say that this practice of Togol is mostly for people to achieve liberation in the bardo. So we can understand that this practice of radiance is really equivalent to Tekchod. They don't use that terminology.
So Tekchod doesn't appear in here.
No, Tekchod and Togol do not appear in this book at all. We have instead the substitute terminology of the practice of radiance, and this radiance is explained in great detail by Longchenpa in this book, what that means, and the practice of luminosity. And also he talks about practice of the night, practice of the day, practice of the night. There's a bit of discussion of dream yoga. And so it's just it's a very different approach to the same material. Now, one of the most important things that we need to understand about Dzogchen teachings is lineage. This is why no one can just pick up a book of Dzogchen and read it and think that they can practice Dzogchen teachings. You have to have a lineage, and that means you have to have a teacher. That means you have to have made the effort to go and sort of inquire of someone and ask them for Dzogchen teachings. Otherwise, you're just it says very clearly in the 17 Tantras, if you don't have a teacher, then you will never know whether or not you've actually discovered your own real state, your discovered knowledge of your own primordial state, if you will, basis. So, and the reason for this is that you have actually had many experiences of your primordial state many times and many lifetimes, over and over and over again. But because no one ever helped you understand this through using methods, you never were able to recognize this experience. So, for example, in every single Vajrayana system claims that at the time of dying, you have an experience of what we're calling luminosity. How this luminosity is understood differs from system to system, but everybody has this idea that everybody experiences a moment of luminosity when they go through the death process, after all of their elements have dissolved. And actually we're talking about the vayus, the winds of the elements dissolve, and then consciousness dissolves. Then you have this brief moment where you have an experience of luminosity, and every creature, down to the tiniest creature you can imagine, has this experience. So everybody, and so this is more or less, we can say, is something like the basis. Of course, in Dzogchen, we don't just stop with luminosity. We have three more, kind of like in Spinal Tap. The guys like, why does your amp say 11? Because it's one more than 10. So in Dzogchen, we have three more aspects to the dissolution process because we can.